Hello.
Hello, how you doing, Juliet?
Good, good. Thank you.
I'll just wait a couple more minutes, see if anybody else joins. I know we always have a smaller class on Thursday. Not as many can make it, but that's okay.
Hello.
Hi, Jenny. How are you?
I'm doing well. Enjoying
Good.
how gorgeous this day is. It's so nice.
Yeah, it is nice out there, huh?
How are you?
It should be nice this weekend, too, I think.
Yeah. I hope so. I don't mind like a little rain, maybe like later on one of the days, but it's nice to have sun.
Right. It is nice. Although the rain brings the nice flowers and everything, makes the grass look good, so we need that too.
Right. I can't believe this is our last meeting.
I know, it went by quick, right?
Yeah.
The end of the semester especially always goes quick, the second half.
Mhm.
So you're right, this is our last meeting today. We will finish the reproductive system. There's not too much left to do. At that point, you've got exam 7, which is due Monday, and you've got a quiz, which is due Sunday night. The homework is due tonight. And so I went in this morning and I put in all your other grades. So those are really the last 3 grades that I have to get in there. So obviously I have to wait till Tuesday, right? Until everybody's finished with those things. But Monday and Tuesday I'll get those grades in. And then you can go to Moodle and make sure that everything looks okay, that I didn't, miss somebody's grade or type something in incorrectly or whatever. So they'll be in Moodle Tuesday. And then I think I have until Friday to get them into, I don't know if is it WebAdvisor maybe for you guys? There's another system at the college that I have to get them into. That's the official system. So I always like to make sure that they're up on Moodle so that you guys can see them for a couple of days before I actually submit them to the college, just to make sure that, again, I didn't make any mistakes or anything. All right. So, are there any questions before we get started? All right. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. And we left off, we were talking about the reproductive system and the male reproductive system in particular. And we left off talking about the accessory glands, which contribute to the semen. And we talked about the seminal glands, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral glands and what they do, what they contribute. And so after that, it just gets into a little bit of the penis. The 3 main regions of the penis are the root, the body, and the glands. Glands is the end of it, which is commonly called that's where the foreskin is. It's a fold of skin over the glands. There are preputial glands on the inner surface of that foreskin that secrete a waxy material. So that can be a nutrient source for bacteria, which is one of the arguments for circumcision, to get rid of that possible source of bacteria for them to live. The actual tissue of the penis fills with blood. There are 3 major kind of compartments that fill with blood when a male gets an erection. And so the anterior part is comprised of 2 caverns, and those are called the corpora cavernosa. So each one is the corpus cavernosa. There's 2 of them. That's why they're corpora cavernosa. And then there's a 3rd compartment called the corpus spongiosum, which surrounds the urethra. Okay, so the urethra is running through the penis. It's surrounded by 1 cavern or 1 chamber called the corpus spongiosum. And then kind of on the anterior surface of that, there are 2 more chambers. Each of those are corpus cavernosa. And so when a person is in resting state, there's very little blood flow, and those arterial branches leading to those 3 chambers are constricted. There's very little blood flow into those chambers. However, during an erection, parasympathetic neurons release nitric acid. So the neurons that kind of slow down your heart rate release a molecule called nitric acid, and that allows the smooth muscle in the arterial walls to relax, and it allows the vessels to dilate. And so those three chambers fill with blood. And so here you can see in this diagram, right? In this diagram, particularly in picture C here in the bottom, you can see this is the urethra, and it's surrounded by the red chamber that's called the corpus spongiosum. And then above that, there are these two chambers which are shown in purple here. Each of those is a corpora cavernosa. Okay, so those are the three chambers that fill with blood. Questions about the male reproductive system? Right, we talked about make sure you know the pathway that the sperm travel through, make sure you know the accessory glands and what they do. And so if there are no questions, we'll go on to the female reproductive system. So in the male reproductive system, the gametes were the sperm. In the female reproductive system, they're called oocytes, and they're produced in the ovaries, right? Those are the eggs, that's just the term for the egg. They travel from there through ducts, and so they're going to start to mature in the ovary. Then they will travel through the uterine tube, which is the same as the fallopian tube or the oviduct. All three of those things are the same. They're just different terminology for the same exact organ. And the uterine tubes lead to a uterus in the center, right? So you have two ovaries, one on the right, one on the left. You have two uterine tubes, and the uterine tubes lead from each ovary to the uterus. And then the uterus leads to a cavern called the vagina. There are some accessory glands to the reproductive system for the female, particularly the greater vestibular gland, which we'll talk about. And then with the male, you had external genitalia of the penis and the scrotum. With the female, you have the labia minora and majora and the clitoris. Okay, so here are a couple of diagrams. We'll kind of zoom in on this a little bit. So from the side, right, you can see that mostly what we're going to be focusing on is the uterus. This uterus here is where a growing embryo will develop. Okay, you can see, sorry, I'm pointing to the bladder. Uterus is right above it. You can see the ovary is here. That's where the egg is being produced. It will travel through this oviduct or uterine tube to get to the uterus. If it's fertilized, the egg will implant in the uterus and an embryo will grow. A lot of times that puts pressure on the bladder, right? You can see that the uterus leads to the vagina, right? This chamber here is the vagina. Where the uterus meets the vagina, that part of the uterus is called the cervix. It's kind of like the neck of the uterus. You can see that the bladder is right underneath the uterus, which is why, again, when women are pregnant, they feel like they have to relieve themselves a lot because there's usually pressure on the bladder. Sorry, and you can see the tube leading from the bladder to the outside of the body is the urethra. Okay. Externally, you have the labia minora and the labia majora and the clitoris. What we are going to focus on, sorry, skip through those pictures. What we're going to focus on is more of these internal compartments. So this is a look from the front. These two purple structures are the ovaries. That's where the eggs develop. The eggs then travel through these tubes, through one of these two tubes. Those tubes are the uterine tubes, which are the oviducts, which are the fallopian tubes, the same thing, that lead to the uterus. And if the egg is fertilized, the egg will grow inside the uterus into an embryo and then eventually into a fetus, right? And the uterus exits into the vagina. Here's the vagina. And the exit of the uterus into the vagina is called the cervix. There's a few other things here to kind of note. There is, at the end of each of these uterine tubes, there are these finger-like projections called fimbriae. And what you'll notice is that the ovary is not actually attached to the uterine tube. There's a little bit of space between the ovary and the uterine tube. You can see it better on this side, it's pulled away. So when the ovary releases an egg, it's actually just in the kind of the pelvic cavity of the body. And the hope is that these little finger-like projections, which are called fimbriae, will kind of guide it into that uterine tube so that it travels down the uterine tube towards the uterus. Okay. Then there are some ligaments. There's a suspensory ligament attaching the ovary to the uterine tube. There is the ovarian ligament attaching the ovary to the uterus on this side, right? So that's what the ligaments are. There's the broad ligament, which is just holding the uterus in place. Okay. So female reproductive system functions to produce the sex hormones, right? Same as the male. In the female, those are estrogen and progesterone. To produce gametes, so those are the oocytes instead of sperm. Support and protects the developing embryo. That's something that the female reproductive system does that the male reproductive system does not. So the female reproductive system is a little more involved because it does have to support and protect that embryo. And it also nourishes the newborn infant, right? Females can produce milk, which is produced solely to nourish an infant. So what are the ovaries? They are paired. They're small. They're kind of almond-shaped organs. You have two of them, one on each side. They're near the lateral walls of the pelvic cavity, so almost at the sides of the pelvic cavity. There is a broad ligament. There is the ovarian ligament, and there is the suspensory ligament, okay, kind of holding the ovaries in place and holding the fallopian tubes and the uterus in place as well. What do the ovaries do? Well, they are there to produce the female gametes, the oocytes. They secrete the female sex hormones. So the ovaries actually secrete estrogen and progesterone, just like the testes in the male secreted testosterone. They also secrete something called inhibin. And inhibin is involved in negative feedback control of FSH, which we'll talk about more about that in a minute. The process of producing those eggs is called oogenesis, just like the process of producing sperm is spermatogenesis. Oogenesis is the process of producing the egg. Before women are born, they start producing these eggs, and it does not end until menopause. So that's a little bit different than males. Women are born with all the eggs, or the ability to start producing eggs. Their body doesn't necessarily wait until puberty. The oogonia are the female diploid reproductive stem cells. So that's the very primitive cells, just like the spermatogonia, that still have to divide. Those are the ones that still have 46 chromosomes. Okay, and they complete mitosis before birth, which means that you're born with all of those eggs, right? And then once they begin meiosis, they're called primary oocytes. Oogenesis stops at prophase 1 until you reach puberty. So from the time a female is born until she reaches puberty, these eggs, right, these oogonia, are starting to become primary oocytes, but they stop at prophase 1. They stop before they really get very far into meiosis until a female reaches puberty. Not all the primary oocytes will survive. So remember, you're going to have a lot of these primary oocytes because you've produced them before, from birth until puberty. There are roughly 2 million of them at birth and only about 400,000 left at puberty. So from the time you're born until you hit puberty, they're degenerating, and there's only about 400,000 left at puberty, and they continue to degenerate throughout your lifetime. So if we compare the production of egg cells to the production of sperm, they both use meiosis, but there's a couple of differences. One is that the primary oocyte does not divide its cytoplasm evenly. So if you remember way back when I talked about meiosis of sperm, and I'll go back to that slide to kind of refresh your memory. Here we go. So we end up with one cell, right, with 92 chromosomes, becomes 2 with 46 chromosomes, and those get divided equally among 4 sperm. In the female, that doesn't happen. You get to this point with the 92, and more of the cytoplasm goes to one side than it does to the other. And instead of ending up with 4 eggs, you end up with 1 egg with all the cytoplasm and all the nutrients, and 3 other little tiny things called polar bodies. Okay, so here's what happens in a female. In a female, because the egg has to nourish the growing embryo, right? The egg is what gets fertilized by a sperm, and it has to have nutrients for that fertilized egg to become an embryo. So instead of taking all your nutrients and splitting them into 4 equal size eggs, what the female body does is it takes the nutrients and it puts most of them in 1 egg. And then you end up with these other little polar bodies. Okay, you end up with these little, again, from this division, most of the nutrients go into the secondary oocyte, and the other division is a polar body, which divides further into 2 polar bodies. And then when this divides further, most of the nutrients go into 1 egg, and you end up with this other polar body. So you really end up with 1 viable egg and 3 polar bodies. You start out with 1 oogonium, right? This is the diploid cell, the cell with 46 chromosomes. You end up with 1 egg and 3 polar bodies. Now they all, if you look, they all have the 23 chromosomes in them, right? But this clearly has more nutrients in it. And the reason that it has more nutrients is because it needs to have those nutrients for the growing embryo. So that's one major difference between the production of sperm and the production of egg. Okay. Does that make sense? Are there questions
Can
on
I
that?
ask a question?
Yeah.
On those 3 polar bodies, what will happen to them later on?
They just get degraded. Nothing, nothing happens to them, yeah.
Nothing happens, just
No.
gone.
Yep.
Okay, just I was wondering if are they gonna be the next one? It doesn't look like it because there's already no.
Yep. Nope, they won't
Okay.
be the next one because there's not any nutrients to support fertilization.
Okay, they're drained of nutrients. Okay.
Right.
That makes sense. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. The other big difference between the male and the female production of gametes is that in the female, what's released from the ovary is actually a secondary oocyte, not a mature gamete. So in the ovary, that ovum, right, that oocyte doesn't completely mature. It gets released from the ovary and released into that uterine tube before it's fully mature. It's still a secondary oocyte at that point, which means it's in meiosis 2, but it's not going through meiosis 2. It's not completing it until after it leaves the ovary. That point where the secondary oocyte is released from the ovary, that's called ovulation. That's what ovulation literally is. It's the somewhat partially matured egg leaving the ovary to head down the fallopian tube towards the uterus. That's ovulation. So that's different than spermatogenesis as well. The sperm don't leave the testes until they're mature, right? That's when they leave the testes and the epididymis and they start their journey through the ductus deferens. Whereas in the female, the journey is started by what's called a secondary oocyte, right? It's not actually a fully formed egg. So what's going on in the ovary? Well, you end up, you have these ovarian follicles, which are these kind of areas of nutrition to support the oocyte growth. And so they're supporting growth of that oocyte and division of that oocyte through the first phase of meiosis. You have a primordial ovarian follicle. That's kind of what you're born with. And that develops into a primary ovarian follicle, and the cells just enlarge and divide, and they form this protective layer around the oocyte. And eventually that becomes a secondary follicle, and that grows to become a tertiary follicle. Tertiary is third. And all that's happening as that's growing is the wall is thickening, right? And the oocyte within it is starting to develop a little bit more, right? By the time you get to a tertiary follicle, the tertiary follicle is pretty large. It's double the size of the secondary ovarian follicle. So from here to here, it doubles in size. And so here's a picture of that. Okay, so this is the ovary. You have all these primordial follicles, right? And one of them is going to start to develop, and that's going to be a primary ovarian follicle, which will develop further into a secondary, which will develop further into a tertiary. In all of these, the oocyte is this little purple circle in the middle with a darker purple nucleus. All these lighter purple cells around it are called follicular cells. They're there to protect the growing ovary and to nourish it, the growing oocyte rather, and nourish it. Once it gets to be a tertiary follicle, right, from secondary to tertiary, it grows a great deal. You end up with a bunch of liquid in there. Once it gets to be a tertiary follicle, that tertiary follicle bursts and releases its secondary oocyte. Remember, this isn't a completely mature egg cell yet. It releases that. Okay, so when that's released, that is ovulation right there. Ovulation is that secondary oocyte being released from the ovary and hopefully making its way down a uterine tube to the uterus, right? That's the whole point. The leftover follicle, which is here now without the oocyte, is called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is really important because the corpus luteum is actually what secretes progesterone. And it's secreting progesterone because it's signaling to the uterus. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but it's signaling to the uterus that there's an oocyte on the way. There's an oocyte traveling towards the uterus. Sorry. So the tertiary follicle is what releases the secondary oocyte. The follicle just ruptures and it leaves the ovary. And what's happening is it's just in that pelvic cavity now. And what you're hoping for is that secondary oocyte gets swept into the uterine tube. Those projections, those fimbriae, those finger-like projections are moving, and they're hopefully moving enough to guide that secondary oocyte into a uterine tube. The uterine tubes are also called the fallopian tubes. They're also called the oviducts, right? One terminology is not more correct than another. They're all the same. The expanded end, the kind of wider end that's closer to the ovary, is called the infundibulum. And at the very end, you have these fimbriae, these finger-like projections, and those are there to try to guide that secondary oocyte from the ovary into the fallopian tube. The walls of the tube move the oocytes towards the uterus. So the walls of the tube are lined with these cells with cilia, and so the cilia are kind of just beating. They're like little hairs, like little eyelashes that are beating and trying to move that egg towards the uterus. Okay. It normally takes 3 to 4 days for the oocyte to reach the uterus. It's during that journey that fertilization must happen. Okay, fertilization doesn't happen in the uterus, it happens in the uterine tubes, it happens in the fallopian tubes. That's why oftentimes if couples are trying to conceive, right, they try to figure out if the woman's ovulating, and there are certain hormones now, there are certain tests that you can take at home to see when a woman is ovulating, because from the time that she starts ovulating, there's only about a 3 or 4 day window for her to get pregnant, right, for fertilization to happen. So it's during that journey of the egg traveling down the fallopian tube toward the uterus that fertilization happens. And actually, it should happen at the beginning of that journey, right, in the first day. So if the egg is fertilized, it will, when it reaches the uterus, it will hopefully implant and become an embryo. If it's unfertilized, it just degenerates in the uterine tube. And so it gets to the uterus and it's actually shed with the menstrual cycle. So the ultimate goal of a fertilized egg is to reach the uterus. That's the pear-shaped muscular organ. There's a bunch of ligaments holding it in place. And it has the bulk of the uterus is called the body. The cervix is kind of the inferior portion of the uterus where it leads to the vagina. And the function is to protect, nourish, and remove waste for developing embryo and fetus. It is made of smooth muscle. A woman has smooth muscle contractions during the birthing process to try to push the fetus through the cervix into the vagina to leave the body. Okay. Body of the uterus is the largest region, right? The cervix is the kind of the shorter end of it, the inferior end of it, where it leads to the vagina. And what is one of the things that's really important to know and understand is that the uterus is made of 3 layers. Excuse me, those 3 layers are called an endometrium, a myometrium, and a perimetrium. So endo is always means inner, right? That prefix means inner. The endometrium is the innermost lining of the uterus, right? The innermost layer. The myometrium is the middle layer. You can remember that because myo, and middle start with M. Myo, the prefix myo really means muscle. And so that's the muscular layer that contracts during labor and delivery. And the outer layer is called the perimetrium. Peri means surrounding. So the perimetrium is the outer layer, right, just surrounding the entire uterus. The important thing to know here is that the endometrial layer thickens in order to accommodate a fertilized egg. So we have to imagine that the egg, the secondary oocyte, is traveling down the fallopian tube. Sperm meets that egg and fertilizes that egg. That fertilized egg then reaches the uterus, right? It's traveling down that fallopian tube to the uterus. When it gets to the uterus and it is fertilized, it's going to implant in that endometrial layer. It's going to kind of stick there. And that's where the embryo is going to grow and be nourished, right? So what happens with a woman's body is that in preparation for that fertilized egg, her body naturally thickens the endometrial layer. Okay, so remember I said when ovulation occurs, when the ovary releases the oocyte, at that point it signals to the uterus. That empty follicle, which we call the corpus luteum, sends out a hormone, progesterone, and the progesterone, its role is to tell the uterus, hey, your endometrial layer has to thicken because there's an oocyte coming your way, right? That's the whole role of it, is that the endometrial layer has to thicken to prepare for the possibility of a fertilized egg. Now, if the egg is fertilized, the endometrial layer is thicker, the fertilized egg will actually implant and an embryo will start to grow. If there is no fertilization of the egg, what happens is the endometrial layer gets shed, and that's what becomes your menses, right? That's what becomes a woman's menses, is the shedding of that innermost layer of her uterine wall. Okay, so here again, we can see kind of this whole picture. Here in purple is the ovary. On this side, everything's intact. On this side, they've kind of cut it open so that you can see. What's going on in the ovary is you're preparing a follicle, so primary, secondary, tertiary follicle. Once that follicle is tertiary, it can burst open and the secondary oocyte within that follicle will travel along this uterine tube to get to the uterus, right? When that follicle releases that egg, when the ovary releases that egg, that's ovulation. That egg is then going to take 3 or 4 days, even 5 days to get to the uterus. It's during this time that fertilization happens, right? It's during this time that sperm can swim from here to get all the way up to the fallopian tube to fertilize the egg. Now, after ovulation happens, you have an empty follicle in this ovary. That empty follicle is going to send out a hormone, right, through all these blood vessels to tell the uterus, hey, thicken your endometrial layer. Because there's an oocyte coming down towards the uterus has to be prepared for that to be fertilized. So this empty follicle, which is the corpus luteum, signals by secreting progesterone to the endometrium that the endometrial layer has to thicken. Now, when this egg travels through the uterine tube, and if it gets fertilized, it reaches the uterus and implants, and an embryo starts to develop. If, when that egg reaches the uterus, it is not fertilized, the body will shed the endometrial layer, okay? And that's what becomes the menses. That's what becomes part of the menstrual cycle. So the uterine cycle is called the menstrual cycle, right? It's repeating series of changes in the endometrial structure. That's really what's happening, is that the female's body is thickening that endometrial layer in order to prepare for a fertilized egg. This continues until menopause, right? So it starts at puberty and it keeps going until menopause. But cycles can be interrupted by things like illness, stress, starvation, and pregnancy, right? So things like illness, stress, starvation, those are things that are going to cause a woman's body to realize she can't nourish an embryo at that point, right? So oftentimes, even like elite athletes, like Olympic level athletes, their period will stop because they're putting their body under so much stress and they have such low amount of body fat that they can't support life, right? They can't support an embryo. Pregnancy obviously stops the cycle as well, because you don't want another egg to implant in that same period of time when your body's already nourishing one embryo. It averages 28 days. That's just an average. There's no reason for your cycle to be 28 days. There's no reason for you to necessarily have a period once a month. Some women would naturally get one, only 8 times a year. Some women might naturally get one 16 times a year. Okay. So the first portion of the uterine cycle is the menstrual phase. That's marked by degeneration of the functional layer of the endometrium. That's what leads to menstruation. So day 1 of your cycle is actually, when we're talking about day 1 of the cycle from this point of view, is actually when you start shedding the endometrial layer. So that is day 1 of your menstrual cycle, is when you're actually getting your period. This is triggered by a drop in progesterone and estrogen as the corpus luteum disintegrates. So that corpus luteum, that empty body, was secreting hormones. As it starts to degenerate, it stops secreting those hormones, and your body realizes there's no fertilized egg, and the body sheds the endometrial layer. The proliferative phase happens after that, right? So after you've shed that layer, after menstruation, after you've shed the endometrial layer, there is an increasing estrogen level, right? As the ovarian follicle starts to grow in the ovary, there's an increasing amount of estrogen. And so what that does is it causes some of these endometrial cells to start to grow, right, and divide and thicken up. So the endometrial layer thickens up. So the functional zone of the endometrium, the layer where things are going to implant, starts to become thicker. And then the third phase is the secretory phase. This begins at ovulation, right? So the woman's endometrial layer is thickening, and then at ovulation, when that secondary oocyte leaves the ovary, there's a even stronger signal that tells the uterus, make sure the endometrial layer is thickening even more, right? So that the rate actually increases. So it starts to thicken at a really high rate. This is stimulated by progesterone and estrogens from the corpus luteum. So this is after the egg leaves the follicle, that empty follicle starts secreting more hormone, higher levels of hormone, to kind of ramp up the thickening of the endometrial layer. I actually wanted to go to this diagram because I like this diagram. It puts all of that together. Okay. So if I can just a little bit bigger, there we go. So this diagram shows kind of 4 panels, right? No, 5 panels, sorry. The top panel is showing the levels of gonadotropic hormones, which are FSH and LH. If you think way back to the endocrine system, everybody's pituitary releases LH and FSH. In the female, they stimulate the ovaries. In the male, they stimulate the testes. The second panel is showing what's happening inside the ovary, right? How the follicle is developing inside the ovary. This third panel shows the level of hormones that the ovary is secreting. So estrogen in red here, progesterone in black. This fourth panel is showing the thickness of the endometrial wall, right? So that the higher this graph is, the thicker the wall is. And this fifth panel is basal body temperature, which I'm not too worried about you guys knowing right now. What I wanted to do is focus on these top 4 panels. So what's happening? In the ovary, you're starting to develop a follicle, right? Primary follicle, secondary, tertiary follicle, and ovulation happens. Now look at the levels of these 2 hormones just before ovulation, right? This dotted line represents ovulation. Well, there's a spike in LH and FSH, and there's a spike in estrogen just before ovulation. So those hormones are really triggering ovulation. They're triggering the release of that oocyte. At this point, right, at ovulation, this secondary oocyte is now making its way down a uterine tube to the uterus. And so what's happening is this empty follicle, right, what was this follicle, starts releasing high amounts of progesterone. Look at this black line here of progesterone. It goes way up. And what that does is it increases the proliferation of the cells on the endometrial layer. So you can see the endometrial layer starts getting even thicker and thicker and thicker. Now, when that oocyte reaches the uterus and it reaches the endometrium, if it's not fertilized, you're going to get the destruction of the functional layer of the endometrium. So these first 5 days here, right, if I can scroll down, first 5 to 7 days here, the woman's body is shedding that endometrial layer, right? And then she's going to start building it back up through the rest of that 28-day cycle in order to prepare for the possibility of a fertilized egg. Now, one thing that I really want to point out here is look at the end of this cycle. Look at the levels of progesterone and estrogen. Right? They're really low, and they have to stay really low in order for a new cycle to start. So when a woman is pregnant, that embryo in the placenta starts secreting estrogen and progesterone. And one of the reasons they do is if you keep these levels of hormones high, a new follicle won't start to develop inside the ovary. Okay, so this follicle or this egg won't start maturing until these estrogen and progesterone levels get really low. Now, many women take oral birth control, right? They take a pill. Does anybody here know what's in that contraceptive usually?
To progesterone?
Mm-hmm. Progesterone or estrogen or a combination of them. Yep.
Is
right.
The LH also?
Could be LH, right? It could be. So if we look at these hormones have to be really low, right? So what those birth control pills do is they keep the levels of the hormone high, right? As long as you're taking that pill, the level of your hormone is high. And if the levels of your hormone are high, then you're not going to produce a viable egg, you're not going to produce a secondary oocyte in the ovary, right? And so even though those levels are high, and even though you're still going to shed your endometrial layer, right? And you're shedding that endometrial layer because you take 3 weeks of the pill and then a week of the sugar pill, right? So what's happening during that week when you're not getting any hormone is you're shedding this layer, then you're taking the hormones again. So you never actually develop a secondary oocyte to get fertilized. Now, there are a lot of things that interact with birth control, even over-the-counter medications, antibiotics notoriously. There are a lot of things that interact with those hormones that kind of make them not do their job in terms of birth control, which is usually why if somebody gets pregnant and they didn't intend to and they were on a birth control hormone, that's usually what happens. The other way that happens is if a person forgets to take their birth control, right? They're supposed to take this every day. You forget it for a day or two, well, then all of a sudden these hormone levels get higher and you're producing a secondary oocyte and you can't go back on that. Those are the reasons that the hormone pills work or don't work sometimes. There are other forms of hormone contraceptive now. There are injections, there are implants, there are things like that can be used, and they are more effective only because there is less chance of misuse of them. If you have to go to a doctor every month to get a shot, or every 3 months to get a shot or to get something implanted, chances are you're not going to miss a day, right? Whereas you might miss a day or two of taking a pill, you might forget to take it. So that's the only reason that those are considered more effective. Okay, but I want everybody, I think a lot of students that I teach don't quite realize what's going on with the hormones and how the birth control pills help, right? Help or how they work, I should say.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So at least in my experience, so what is nursing has to do, why does it stop menstrual cycle? Like when I was nursing my son, I didn't have period for 5 months, and then suddenly I was pregnant. No period at all.
Wow.
From birth.
So when you're nursing, you are keeping those hormone levels high, right?
Okay.
So because the hormone levels don't get that low, you're not getting any of those secondary oocytes. Now, the other thing that happens, though, and this happens with a lot of mammals, but with people as well, it's pregnancy happens more frequently within, I think, a year of giving birth. So a woman is more fertile, the female is more fertile for whatever reason. I don't know if that's because she's already ramped up everything in her body to support life. All kinds of things happen when a woman's pregnant that are amazing. Her blood flow increases by 150%, and all these things happen in order for her to nourish that embryo. And I think the reason that evolutionarily, the reason that a woman could be more fertile after short time after birth is because their body's already ramped up and ready to do that, right? Their body's already ready to nourish that embryo and all set to go. So you didn't get a period because your estrogen and progesterone levels were high enough while you're nursing, but also when you do start getting a period, when you do start making the secondary oocytes, you're going to be more fertile for that first 6 months or year even, just because I think the body's already ready to support life, to support another embryo.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's why it's just 5 months in between.
They call that Irish cousins, right? Or I'm sorry, Irish twins. My wife is only I think there's about 1.5 years between her and her sister, so same kind of thing where her sister was an infant when her mom got pregnant with her.
That's how my boys are.
Yeah.
I would have one in a backpack and one in a front pack. it worked, you know. But
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's probably easier. My son is 4, and my daughter's only like a year and a half, and
yeah,
it's hard. It's hard to chase around a toddler, and it's just a hard
yeah,
thing to do when they're
yeah.
that.
I don't know how I survived it, but
Yeah,
somehow I did.
yeah, exactly. All right. So, I mean, that's my talk on the reproductive system. I think there's a lot of really interesting things. I kind of wish, I wish maybe I'd rearrange the schedule of weeks and do this more when we do the endocrine system. I've seen it done that way. And I kind of like that because you get a little more in depth and you get a few more questions and things like that about the reproductive system. So I think, I prefer to teach A&P that way. If I had the freedom to do it, I would probably do that. I haven't seen that until this semester, but it seemed to work out really well in one of the other classes I was teaching. But do you guys have any other questions about the reproductive system for me?
Okay, I'm gonna ask something.
Sure.
When a woman get a tube tied,
Mhm.
it's like it's before it goes down to the fallopian tube, usually, right? That's where it
Right.
is. So what happens, somewhere, I think below ampulla, somewhere
Right.
there.
Somewhere around
Yeah.
here. Yep.
So what happened when the eggs, without tube tie, the eggs go down to the uterine cavity and shed off with the menses. So if the tube is tied, what happened to the eggs that's in there? It's just absorbed by the body.
Yeah. Yep. They just degenerate and get reabsorbed by the body. Absolutely.
Okay. I was like wondering if that can cause health problems.
No. Usually that doesn't cause any health problems. You're more likely to have health problems from being on, a hormone replacement, like from being on, contraceptive pills for 20 years or something is more likely to cause a health problem than having your tubes tied. Now,
It's just
obviously,
not
having your tubes tied is more of a definite thing, right? It's
right. It's not reversible. Actually, my sister-in-law had her tube tied, but not cut.
Mhm.
It's just tied. It's still reversible. And so when she got a boyfriend, she decided she wanted to try another child. So she went to the doctor to loosen up the whatever they put in there, the tie.
Mhm.
And the doctor said it's too late.
Oh, at that point, it's like closed up pretty much.
She's already pregnant.
Oh, she's already pregnant. Oh, so it happened. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely people that even with getting their tubes tied and cut, that the tube can actually, the cells can regenerate and the tube can grow back together just enough for an egg to make its way through there. And it sounds like in your sister's case, it sounded like the egg was able to make it through the tube. It wasn't tied off, I guess, as tight as it could possibly be. And, you're talking about a little microscopic egg, really. So yeah, there are cases of that. The same thing with, so that getting your tubes tied is a somewhat invasive procedure, because they have to cut open the abdomen to do it. The other way, or the other procedure that is equally as effective for preventing pregnancy, is to have a man have his tubes tied, essentially, or cut, and that's called a vasectomy. So I'm going to go back to the male here for a second. So with a vasectomy, what they do is they cut the vas deferens, which is the ductus deferens, right? So you've got this tube that leads from the testes to the urethra. If you cut that tube, then there's no pathway for the sperm to get into the penis. So the penis still works normally. There's still semen, but there's no actual sperm in there. And it's a less invasive procedure. It's usually an outpatient procedure. Whereas with a female, they have to actually cut open her abdomen, her pelvic cavity, and get in there and do some pretty serious surgery.
Right. I had mine done during C-section, so get it all done. But yeah.
That's what my wife had. My wife had a C-section, and that's when she had hers done, because you know, they've already cut her open. They're already right there.
Exactly. So with that vasectomy, I don't know if it's true. I just heard some men said that it reduced their testosterone level.
It it is not supposed to. I've heard that. I don't know how true that is. You can certainly, because all you're cutting is so there's actually a whole cord that goes from the testes to the urethra. And in that cord, it's like several tubes wrapped up in that cord. And one of those tubes is the tube that the sperm travel through. And that's the only one that you're cutting, right? So you're not cutting any blood vessels. So the testes are still making testosterone, which is still getting into your bloodstream. So there shouldn't be any impact of that, right? Because you're not cutting the blood vessels that are leading from the testes. So the testes are still making testosterone, which is still getting into your bloodstream, and it should still be affecting your body in the same way. So it shouldn't affect like your sex drive or anything like that.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Now I got it. So
Yeah.
I guess they're just making excuses.
Right. I mean, I don't know. I don't have vasectomy, so I don't know. But you know, the couple of people that I know that have one, they don't have any issues with sex drive or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Great. So I had a wonderful semester, and I hope you guys did too. I was pleasantly surprised by the online class. There were several of you that really participated a lot, and I had a really enjoyable time meeting with this class. And I will certainly get your grades up at the beginning of next week. I just have to wait for those last couple of things to come in. And certainly email me if you have questions over the weekend or anything like that. Email me, and I'll do my best to answer them as quick as I can. All right.
Before we separate our ways, do you teach A&P 1?
So in the fall, I'm teaching A&P. Let me grab my book. I'm not sure.
I just want to say thank you so much. I really enjoyed this class, and sorry I didn't have video access this semester, but I enjoyed participating and hearing what everyone was thinking and hearing everyone's questions. And thank you so much for all of your answers and communication.
Oh, thank you very much, Jenny. I really appreciate it. I thought this class went really well. I thought it was going to be harder to get responses from people, but everybody did a good job asking questions and everything. So I have written down for GCC that I was asked to teach Bio 194, which is this class again, and Bio 126, which is A&P 2, completely
fall?
online in the fall.
126? I am on 126 class.
126, I think, is basic biology.
Right. Maybe it's 216.
So I don't know if I wrote down the number wrong. Or
maybe it's 216. A&P 2 is 216.
Maybe it's 216.
Right.
I think she said A&P 2. I have the email.
Yeah, it's 216.
Yeah, so it must be 216, not 126. It's A&P 2 completely online. I just don't know what section or anything it is.
Okay, because they will want me to do 126 so I can do biology, A&P 1.
Gotcha.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the class. This is like so much better than what I am expecting. I was really nervous when I started, so.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. That's good. I enjoyed it too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, everybody. Have a great day.